Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is September 1st, Labor Day, so happy Labor Day, everybody. And before we get started, I just want to address something. In the last episode we did, we were talking about these border skirmishes between India and China. And Dad, you were saying that, oh, one reason, they don't use firearms up there is because there's not enough oxygen. That's actually not true. Bullets have their own oxidizers, so you can fire bullets in space. Many people corrected us on that, so thank you for that. It's one of those things I feel like when I heard it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. You just assume it's true. It's
Uh,
like the Great Wall of China, you can see it from space. You've heard that. It's completely
yeah.
bogus, but it's one of those things that you just hear and just like, okay, it sounds more or less right. But yeah, that's not right. So thanks for catching us on that. Um,
Uh,
yeah, anything you want to say,
I
Dad?
stand corrected. Yes. No, I do appreciate the corrections. I really know very little about firearms, and I think it showed. So anyway, I
That's
know a
right.
little bit more now.
Yeah,
Thanks to our viewers.
yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's just jump into some news then. We had a pretty eventful weekend. Let's start with the assassination of the Prime Minister of Yemen. Um, First of all, can you tell us was the strike carried out? He was killed along with his cabinet. Can you just tell us a little bit about it, and then
Yeah.
we'll go from there?
I'll be honest. I don't know a whole lot about it, except that it was, a devastating strike. It killed the prime minister and a number of government ministers in Yemen. So it just took out a good part of the leadership of the Houthi, the Yemeni government. Um, it's something that we've seen Israel do. They did that to Hezbollah, to Iran. It's part of the Israeli playbook, and it's always celebrated, of course, within Israel, but even among Israel supporters around the world. There's never seems to be any moral qualms. Now, I'm not making any firm predictions or advocating anything, but if one day Israel's on the receiving end of a strike like that, I suspect that the reaction is going to be very different among Israel supporters. There'll be horror in a sense that, like the barbarism that Israel has been subjected to. This is just crosses every red line. Well, the hypocrisy, you just know, there just seems to be one rule for Israel. They can do whatever they want. And, there's never a word of condemnation now. There used to be in the past, even among its supporters in the West, when Israel went too far, there would be condemnation, pressure, and Israel would have to pull back. But not now. Maybe it's only when they deliberately target journalists employed by Western news agencies do they get a little bit of um, a castigation. But they can do these kind of things with impunity, and I find them horrifying. I mean, it's just really beyond the, war is horrible in general, but, there are generally, warring parties generally recognize that there are certain limits. And one thing is, like, even during World War II, there was no effort to actually take out the leadership of the opposing governments, between the warring parties. They were engaged in a war of annihilation, but still there were certain places they didn't go. Not the Israelis; they'll go there.
Right. So, no regard for international law. That's clear. But what is the objective? What are they hoping to get out of this? Like, is there a strategic goal here?
Yeah, well, I think that the idea is to make the Yemenis, the Houthis, pay the price, because because Israel has been suffering as a consequence of this embargo that the Houthis have enforced on the Red Sea here. It has had a real, economic consequence for them. They have suffered real economic losses, and they also, the occasional missile that gets through and hits Ben Gurion Airport, that hurts them too. They've had the airport has been, if not entirely shut down as a result of such strikes. Numerous airlines have canceled flights, for over a period of weeks, and that there too is another economic impact. So they're trying to make them pay the price and think twice about what they're doing. But so far they haven't had any success, and it looks like once again they failed, because I hear that an Israeli tanker was struck by a ballistic missile, fired from Yemen, just I think this morning.
Right. So you think that this decapitation strike in Yemen, if anything, it's just going to harden the resolve of the Houthis? I mean, that was my initial reaction when I saw this. I was like, well, the Houthis have been bombed for decades now. And this is just, you're doing these low blows, going after political leaders. It'll probably strengthen the resolve of the Houthis and garner more support for the people of Yemen. Do you think so? Or
Yeah, well, in general, that seems to be true. It just, it's not, in general, this idea of taking out the leadership, that's going to, that's going to seriously degrade the fighting ability of whether it's a militia or a nation, is false. There are other people that can fill those positions. Sometimes those new people are even more competent and charismatic than the old ones. That happened in the case of Nasrallah, whose predecessor was killed, assassinated by the Israelis in the early 2000s. And then Nasrallah, filled his shoes and became, a much more effective enemy of the Israelis. Now, it seems like, on the other hand, when they Hezbollah lost Nasrallah, I think they lost somebody who was valuable to them. It was a real loss that he wasn't really replaceable. But Hezbollah is still there, and it will survive. And there may very well be another Nasrallah, for Hezbollah in the future. Just in general, it's just that, I think Nasrallah was an exceptional individual. But in general, these people are replaceable. I mean, it really doesn't affect the fighting ability, of the army or, the military organization.
So you said that the West celebrated this attack. Is that true?
Actually, I don't know. But they have celebrated it in the past, and I'm assuming. I haven't heard any condemnations.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Is I haven't seen it. I just haven't seen much talk about it. I haven't seen any open condemnation of this attack.
Right. Yeah. But I don't think there will be any. But there was. I did read celebratory articles in mainstream media about, for example, the decapitation strike on Hezbollah, and also on the IRGC, the Iranian leadership, and no condemnation whatsoever.
I think the way that the West tries to justify it is just by framing it as like, oh, the Hezbollah, that's a terrorist organization. This isn't a political organization. And they can say when they assassinated Hania in Tehran, they say, oh, well, that's Hamas. That's a terrorist organization as well. And I think they're trying to do the same thing here in Yemen, because I see some people portrayed as this was the prime minister of Yemen. Other people say, no, this was a Houthi faction. He's not representative of Yemen. So that way it's like, it's okay. We're not actually killing any real heads of state. Does that argument hold any weight to you?
Yeah, I think, there is kind of some ambiguity in the case of Yemen. It's essentially the country is run by the Houthis, but not entirely. And there are some countries that don't recognize their leadership, but they are the de facto leaders of Yemen. And now, but this is something that any organization that opposes Israel is always designated by Israel and its supporters as a terrorist organization, and that's basically the criterion. Do you oppose Israel? You're a terrorist. Even if they're very careful about avoiding civilian casualties, while the Israelis themselves clearly are not. Even if they're doing something on principle like the Houthis, to try to stop a genocide, well, they're the terrorists, and the ones that are actually committing the genocide are not. So it's an absurd labeling that takes place, but it's faithfully, sycophantically followed by Western media.
Isn't Israel a little bit worried about this? Like you said, you open yourself up to these types of attacks as well. If you continue to assassinate your opponent's leadership, doesn't that make it fair game for your leadership? And then I'm just kind of surprised by the West if you're trying to project this image of morality and a leadership position, you have to condemn these types of assassinations. Murdering political leaders is not okay. And it just, do you think there's an attempt to normalize it in the West that they're acting? And is there an
Well,
agenda?
I think there's not an attempt. I think it already is normalized. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
you're
just
right. You're
happened
right.
again.
Yeah.
10, 20 years ago, there would have been condemnation. There was a standard that that the West seemed felt obliged to at least rhetorically uphold, but just don't see it now. And I think it applies to Ukraine too. It's just that the Ukrainian government is violating human rights left and right. Suppressing, outright banning the church of the majority of believers within Ukraine, and language rights. We know. And the old Europe. Yeah, it might have been hypocritical that it didn't really back up its words with action, but it would have said something. It would have made something of a fuss. And even, prior to the launch of the SMO, there were criticisms. Like, for example, when the Ukrainians, the coup was first carried out, like the first act of the Rada was to suppress the Russian language. And actually the EU at that time said, hey, that's not a good idea, and made them walk it back. But now you just never hear anything. It's just like so I have to say that all these kinds of behaviors that at one time, were unacceptable have become acceptable in the West. Whatever they say, it's on the books that, oh yeah, we're for human rights and it's, et cetera, and against war crimes. But when it's our proxy or, our, ally or whatever, yeah, it clearly doesn't apply. There was a time when it did apply. Those standards meant something, but they don't anymore.
What happened? What made us slip and engage into this behavior? If it's such a recent development, you said 10 years ago we would have condemned this.
Right. Well, I think there's always been a double standard. Like in the case of, the Palestinians, you would get condemnations sometimes of Israeli actions, but they were never really backed up. And so it just over time, I think, like the Israelis began to realize that they could get away with more and more. It's hard for me to explain, but the West has undergone a real transformation. On paper, it still stands for all these things, but it seems to me that no longer does it. It has become just, at best an amoral, supporter and, more than that, but, an obedient servant of global hegemony, of American-led global hegemony. And, anything that resists this, I guess, you can say that it is sort of an outcome or the consequence of some kind of extraordinary hubris. It's just a sense that we are the good ones. Therefore, all those people that oppose us in one form and another, are simply, aren't fully human almost. That seems to be what happens, and it's just like, they are the orcs or the terrorists or whatever they are. I can't really say why that has happened, but it clearly has. And it's something that didn't just start happening these last few years. There's been a trend going way, way back. The West has undergone a transformation. I was just struck, again by just the other day, just reading a news story about how the Greens have become a real warmongering party, and I remember the Greens of like back in the 1970s and 1980s, and they were a real peace party back then. I remember actually being in Harvard in the 1980s, just visiting a friend. And Petra Kelly, who was a leader of the Greens, came there to give a speech, and it was, all about avoiding nuclear war and, making sure that no missiles were installed in Europe and all that. And now, just very recently, the contrast, the U.S. stated that they're going to install Typhoon, missile launchers, which can launch these nuclear capable missiles. And they've made the statement after, tearing up the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, that was the cause of so much protest back in Europe back in the 1980s. But here, there's not a sound, nothing, and certainly not from the Greens, not from any leftist party. Maybe the very honorable, okay, there may be more than one, but a very honorable exception is Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany. But they don't even have representation in the German parliament. So it's just all over. I mean, I'm just giving the example of the left. There's just and the absence of any kind of popular uprising about anything. The one thing where we see a conscience and we do see popular protests is with respect to Gaza, and that's the hardening thing about it. What's happening in Gaza is so horrible, but you are starting to see marches, and there's sort of like an awakening of conscience, and I hope that leads to more, something that goes beyond Gaza. But the horror in Gaza seems to have woken up quite a few people.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we are normalizing assassinations and this type of behavior where we've just stooped so low. Do you think that it's in large part just a sign of our weakness? Because we're morally we're weak, but militarily we're weak. We're not able to impose our morality and our will around the world. So we have to engage in sort of these trick plays and nefarious means because we can't meet people on the battlefield conventionally. I mean,
yeah, I don't think so. Maybe there's something to that, but I don't think so. I think it is just a moral degradation, independent of anything else. Because I think it would actually be to our advantage if we went out and made these statements. Whether it was with respect to Ukraine or whatever, it would show, the world and even the Russians and the Ukrainians said, okay, yeah, Europe and the West, they are serious about these things. And
make what statements? What are you saying?
Well, for example, condemning human rights violations in Ukraine.
Right.
That's just one example. That I think that would actually be to our benefit and to Europe's benefit. It would just there is for a long time, let's say reformers and people with conscience, and even in places like Russia, look to Europe and to the West in general, as sort of a beacon of humanity. And they've seen that beacon just dim and go out now. They don't see it. So, so even, those people who were predisposed to, favor the West, to be suspicious of their own government, are actually reorienting and have given up on the West. But if we actually insisted on, I think, these things, on human rights, it would actually, strengthen our position vis-a-vis, both Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it would make, but we don't. I think it comes down to it. We just don't care. It's just like that whole concern. It's just like there's just it's gone. That conscience has no longer exists among European, the Western political class.
Have we had periods of time where political leaders have completely lost their conscience, and then we recover it? I mean, I don't want to afraid that we go down somewhere real dark because this moral slide. Can you reverse it? I just feel like with the current leadership, I think these people are irredeemable. I just get that sense. They just don't seem to have a conscience. These people are in charge, but maybe. Again, maybe it's going to be another generation, that will replace them and will. Again, we are starting to see the beginnings of some large scale protests within Europe at any rate. Not yet within the U.S., but I think it could come here too. Go ahead. Well, what are the consequences if we continue down this slide? I mean, where we are now, is it just mean that the world is going to become a scarier place because we have normalized assassinations of political leaders and your opponents? And is there a risk that the rest of the world starts to descend into, has to match U.S. depravity and engaging in conflicts, or does that create just a stark balance, and people are now able to see, well, what's good and what's evil more
Yeah.
clearly, and just isolate the United States, and we move towards the
Right.
multipolar world?
Right. Well, yeah, there's no reason that, for example, Russia or other opponents of the U.S. need to go down that road.
Well, did Russia just assassinate a
Yeah,
Ukrainian
I,
MP?
I was just going to bring that up. But yeah, on the other hand, it sometimes eh, it it does pressure the other side, and maybe you can even argue forces them to respond in kind. Because of course there have been numerous assassinations, and we've heard about some recent ones in within Russia. But it actually goes back to 2014. There have been hundreds and hundreds of actually assassinations, especially within the Donbass, carried out by um, Ukraine and its agents. And it appears, we can't be completely sure. Like, again, this assassination could have been carried out by another Ukrainian. Ukrainian politics can be very violent. And, somebody like that is going to have um, enemies, and he had, including within Ukraine. So we don't know for sure, but I think there's good reason to be suspicious that the Russians were behind it. I mean, I think that's a well-founded suspicion, not a proven suspicion, but a well-founded one. And it would be an example of where, it's just like the other side eventually responds in kind, and we have, what's called a dirty war, which is not pretty, but still, I think it falls far short of the of the entire mindset again of the Ukrainian um, leadership. Again, it's not like the Russians are suppressing the Ukrainian language on their side of the border or anything like that. They're not. Um, but Uh, yeah, I mean, you you have kind of if you look at it, there is going to be, we see evidence of some kind of response, some sort of tit for tat between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But there's also the truth that I think the Russians and others understand that it's actually, you know, it's not to their benefit in a lot of ways to go down that road. Again, the rest of the world, they want to appear to be, the more moral party to this dispute. Want to have that image, projected to the rest of the world, and I think that's looking at it kind of cynically. But then also, I think maybe they really, they are different. They haven't been completely. Swept away by this ideological extremism that leads the Ukrainians and the Zionists to do what they do.
Right. Well, just a couple weeks ago, I was arguing that perhaps the ethical position to take would be for Russia to engage in this type of behavior. But it's one of these real big moral questions. Just because
Yeah,
we were talking about the massive casualty rate and that 1.7 million dead or missing leak, and who knows the exact number, but it's a
yeah,
huge number, and these are just Ukrainian men that had lives, families, fathers, brothers. It's just it's just horrible. And so you're thinking like, well, if it's these Banderite neo-Nazis that are in Western Ukraine that are rounding up these men and throwing them in a van and sending them to the front to die, then shouldn't we take out those people? This is the ideology headquarters right here, centered amongst these people, but they're not the ones that are doing the dying. They're sending the everyday average Ukrainian to die. So but we just started this conversation off just saying how these political assassinations, this is a no. It's not okay in any sense. But I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. Is this
right, right.
it's like I don't want to say
Yeah,
it's okay
right,
when one side does
right.
it. It's like you have to have the rules. Nobody can do it, right?
Yeah,
We don't want
right,
to.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. Well, again, there's nothing close to any political decapitation strike that's been carried out or attempted against Ukraine. Actually, in the case of like the most recent two assassinations, you could point to specific crimes that if the Russians were behind it, and we don't know for a fact that the Russians were, but if they were behind it, it could be just like the execution of judgments against these people for crimes that they committed. not just an attack on the political leadership as such. Because let's see, the first one, I forget his name right now, but he was in military intelligence, a very high-ranking officer in military intelligence, killed, what was it, a month or two ago. But he was apparently very much involved in the Kursk invasion and in the atrocities that were committed there. That's the Russian charges. Now, this other one is,
Can you tell us what the atrocities that were committed in Kursk were?
Well, apparently just the outright massacre of civilians, the kidnapping of civilians, I think we're talking about hundreds, not just a couple dozen, but just the deliberate massacre. And again, the Russians say they have accumulated a lot of evidence. They conducted a very careful investigation. I know that the very brave, frontline reporter Patrick Lancaster, witnessed some. He remember he said he recalled going into a basement and just seeing these bodies there of clearly civilians, men, women, children, and their hands bound. And so it looks like that there were atrocities carried out on a large scale in Kursk. And so, the Russians have said clearly, said that these people need to be brought to justice. And this man that was assassinated a couple months ago apparently was very much involved in that. Those are the charges anyway. And then this other person, this ultra nationalist that was just killed the other day, he's been part of the ultra nationalist movement from the beginning, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. And he was involved in the Maidan coup. Apparently, like he was in charge of the people that carried out that false flag attack. The killings of the protesters that was used as a justification for the coup. And then he was also involved in the burning of the trade union building in Donbass. That's what I don't know what his involvement was, but I've heard that stated in a couple places.
In Odessa, right?
In Odessa, in Odessa, correct. That was, and I know, actually the Russians have said long ago that they're going to bring those people to justice. So maybe that's what this is about. So it's a little bit different. It's not what the Israelis are doing. It's not that these people have actually involved in direct crimes against citizens of their country, but they're just leaders of an opposing power. I think it is on a different level. You can differentiate from them. But, of course it does there's some point there are gray areas, and I think right now we're not seeing anything that you could, anything close to equivalence. But we could, there is a danger that you could eventually get there.
Right. Well, we talked about this. I believe it was after Operation Spiderweb that Russia might be kind of framing the SMO differently, evolving from an SMO into a counterterrorism operation, which this would kind of more fit into that framework of a counterterrorism operation. But do you see this war getting dirtier? And do we have, you use the term dirty war, it's turning into a dirty war. Have we had an example of a dirty war? What do you expect? Is it just not as much ground fighting and more going after opponents' leadership?
Well, I think there's going to be no let up in the ground fighting, on the combat there, right there on the, the battlefronts will be just as intense as ever, and may in fact intensify. But it's just, in addition to that, we may have more assassinations. And I believe that the Russians actually did engage in something very similar in the South Caucasus. And again, it was the other side that began, these assassinations and terrorist attacks. They didn't engage in terrorist attacks. They're not like blowing up schools with children in them or anything like that. But assassinations of political leaders, that's something that they did carry out in the South Caucasus, in the wars that occurred there a couple decades ago.
Okay. Well, where do you see this all going?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's just there's always this logic to war, which always, it seems to always spread. And maybe, you try to contain it and it's hard to contain, especially if the other side continually provokes and you finally, the logic of war tells you have to respond. And here we are. So again, we don't know for sure, but it kind of, I think there's reason to believe that the Russians are responding to the assassinations that the Ukrainians have been carrying out, against them. And then, the greater danger, that's a little disturbing, but it's still, I think, that doesn't necessarily have to have huge consequences, certainly for the region or the world. The greater danger, of course, is really the escalations, the provocations coming from the West, like the missile strikes that were carried out under Biden towards the end of his term. That was quite alarming, and it was the logic of that kind of escalation was actually attacks on NATO targets, because here is NATO is attacking Russia. And the Russians at some point may just feel like they're obligated. They simply have to respond in kind, and we could have, and then where do we go from there? That's the scary thing. That's the thing that I worry about more, more than a dirty war. That may be kind of dirty, but it's still, when you look at like total casualties and the potential for World War III, those risks really aren't there.
You know what else worries me?
What?
Is just Trump and his tweeting. Did you see that one over the weekend where he's standing there with the world and he's got his hands up and it says, "The world will soon understand. Nothing can stop what is coming." Did you see that image?
I missed that one. My goodness, what is that all about?
It's like, that's the guy in charge of my nukes, So I'm surprised you didn't see that, but it was on Twitter. The only thing that it doesn't make me feel a lot better, but the only thing that I could say is that I went to find his original post on Truth Social, and this was a day after he posted. I saw it all over Twitter, and then I'm like, I want to go to the original one and see it. I had to scroll for like 5 minutes just to go back one day on his post. This guy is just nonstop. Just like there was like 100 posts since that one. I was like, it's only been 20 hours since you did this, man. Like, what's going on? So right. I don't know if that makes me feel better. So it's just like, I'm thinking maybe it's a numbers game. You tweet 1 million times. One of them's going to be crazy apocalyptic messaging, and I shouldn't worry about it. But I don't like that. I've talked about my fear of him just kind of thinking that he does have some divine purpose, and his divine purpose is to do whatever Israel tells him to do. That's my fear.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a reason to be worried. And, what can I say? He'd also, on the other side, I think he has a sound instinct against, larger wars and U.S. involvement in larger wars. He got involved, obviously, in the 12-day war, and there was an attack on the facilities, but you saw, what happened. There was that strike, and then they pretty quickly shut things down, even let the Iranians retaliate. It's just like, that's, again, similar to the Soleimani assassination during his first term. I think that's the way he preferred to do. But the thing is, he's just playing a very dangerous game. He was lucky in a way that he got out of there. It's like you go out on a minefield and you get back out of it. And you say, wow, look, all those people that were telling me not to get involved, look, it worked out. He said, but eventually you keep on going out on a minefield. You play these games, a mine's going to blow up. Like maybe the next time the U.S. gets involved, the Iranians actually do shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And then we're all screwed.
He's the last person I want behind, in these types of crisis situations, because I think he's comfortable with making decisions that you should not be comfortable making. Like, let's drop a bomb on these people, let's do nukes, let's invade Venezuela, let's do something, let's take Greenland.
Right.
So, I mean, once he's in that situation, when a real war's going, it's like, I don't know how we can survive with this type of leadership. Where he seems to be just too easily manipulated. It's just, you tell him how great he is, how awesome he is, and he's like, all right, who do you want me to bomb again? Thanks for telling me that. It's just, that's not, you don't want to be, very vulnerable to praise if you're just surrounded by sycophants. It's like
Yeah, well,
that's
that's the danger, especially with the case of Israel. I think there are some other voices, some voices of at least semi-rationality around him when it comes to Ukraine. But that's just not the case when it comes to Israel. He's surrounded by sycophants and crazies. And, that's the bad news. You're right. Again, I do think he has he really truly does want to avoid any sort of long-term involvement in a war. But he may not be able to do that if he gets involved. Sometimes, just like I'm talking about the logic of war, you think that so often you hear this, we'll just get it, this war is going to last 2 weeks. I think like the Civil War in the U.S. began that way. That was the thought on both sides. And of course, it went on for 4 years. And the same thing happened with the First World War in Europe. Everyone thought it was going to be over quickly. So, quite often we see this. You go into a war thinking it's going to be quick and easy, and then you find you just can't get out of it, and it expands, and it just becomes bloodier than you ever imagined. And there's always the danger of that happening in the Middle East. It's just like for the time being, he got out of this pretty quickly, and I think it actually, improved his standing with his base and so forth. But if he gets bogged down, and it could happen, I mean, again, military bases get hit, American soldiers are killed, the Strait of Hormuz is shut down, and then all of a sudden there are huge consequences, and the pressure to actually commit even more forces is there. It's a very, very dangerous game. Again, he might get lucky in the future and manage to keep it short. The U.S. role anyway, limited, but he might not. He's shown a willingness to go where other leaders didn't go. Like in his first term, the recognition of Jerusalem and of the Golan Heights. Those were kind of red lines that previous administrations were afraid to cross, and he crossed them. And now you notice the subsequent administration, Democratic, they accepted it. This is sort of a ratchet effect. But then the attack on Iran, previous administrations, the Biden administration was, I think, clearly considering it, but they again and again made the decision, no, we don't want to do this. This is just too dangerous, and they kept out of it. But he went there, right? That's the thing. Now, he did get out of it, but the thing is, every time you do that, it's like walking out on the minefield. There's just no guarantee that you won't step on a mine, and then you're stuck.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's also, like you said, the ratchet effect. It's like, I bombed him once, and I got a great victory. Poll numbers went up. This was great.
Yeah.
I can do it. It's like, I did it once, I could do it again type of thing. Yeah, and there was Alexander Mercouris had a program out a couple days ago where he was talking about, the increased likelihood of an attack on Iran from either Israel or Israel and the United States. And I didn't get to finish the episode because whenever I listen to Alexander Mercouris, it's usually before I go to bed, and I get like 10 minutes in and he puts me to sleep. So I'm always kind of like half like, what was the dream about that? But I think it was about the IAEA who was saying that they were kicked out for a good reason. We talked about this before, how the IAEA was in many ways looks like complicit in this attack that gave the green light to Israel to do this. Strong suspicion and evidence that they actually were funneling information about Iran's nuclear scientists to Israel for assassination to kill them along with their families. So obviously, Iran is not very happy with the IAEA and is kicking them out, and then that they might use this as a pretext. Oh, well, now you're not subject to inspection, so we have to attack you. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. The thing is, it's potentially that will happen. But, I think, as I pointed out in an earlier episode, that we're not hearing that kind of rhetoric from either the Americans or the Israelis themselves. You can see how that might happen, but first of all, there is a big obstacle to it, and that is that Trump himself is tying his reputation to the success of his attack on the nuclear facilities with the B-2 bombers. And again, he obliterated them, right? That's that's what he's claiming, and so there's no need to go back. He fired the DIA head, who said that no, that they weren't obliterated. But that just shows that he does not want to revisit that. And so he's going to be fighting it. We're not hearing any, warnings about about a nuclear program in Iran from the Americans. And we're not hearing from the Israelis either. And there may be a good reason that we're not hearing it from the Israelis. The Israelis may want to do it, but they ran out, or very nearly ran out, of air defense interceptors. And they're going to have to build up those stocks again, and it may take a long time. So I think there's some, you never know. Again, like who knows what's going on behind the scene? Like none of us could have foreseen Operation Rising Lion, as this that the Israelis carried out, and that was the beginning of this war. So they may have some other trick up their sleeve. Who knows? But just looking at what we do know about, and the absence of rhetoric, I see some really major obstacles to this war taking place soon. I may be proven wrong tomorrow, but I think it's going to be several months at least before it kicks up again. And I would think that it would be preceded, just like the last war, by a lot of rhetoric and a lot of, alarm bells ringing and claims that they were, just 2 weeks away from a bomb and all that kind of stuff that we were getting, right? We're not getting any of that. I'm not hearing it anyway. Maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like there's no effort to actually prepare the ground, prepare public opinion for a war. So I don't see it happening. If we start hearing those, then I'll change my mind. I may change my mind, but I'm just not hearing it yet.
Didn't Netanyahu have like a court date the day after the start of Operation Rising Lion? Something like this. So, do we know when his next court date is? I mean, this could be really. I know it sounds silly, but his political survival, it seems to be a big motivating factor on starting different conflicts for him.
Yeah, I recall, like, that court date. It was put off, and then it was put off for a significant period of time. It may be sometime this month or next month. If I can't remember the exact date. But he's been done pretty well at kind of always coming up with an excuse, and I remember the last article that I read on it. There hasn't been anything recently, so I don't think the court date is at all imminent. There would be stories in Haaretz about it. I haven't seen any, but I remember reading a very pessimistic opinion piece in Haaretz a couple months ago, and he's saying that it's just like, it looks like they're just not, they can't get him. They're having he's just too wily. It just looks like that he's figured out defenses and ways of keeping out of the court's clutches.
The way he does it is starting a conflict, right? As
that's part of it. That's just part of it. I think it's also pressures on the Supreme Court itself, that he's really gone tooth and nail after the kind of what he calls the deep state. It's just like the kind of the old, let's say, Ashkenazi establishment, sort of liberal establishment within Israel, in the security services, the Supreme Court, their equivalent of the Justice Department, and is having some success, and just sort of like molding all of the institutions to become more faithful to him. I guess in some ways it does mirror what Trump is doing. But anyway, I guess what I'm saying is we can't count on that. That's there. It's possible. It may be that it will become an imminent threat to him again. As that happens, I think we really do need to worry about war, because that is a way out for him. But it appears not to be an imminent threat at this point.
Okay. Can you give me any update on Venezuela? What's going on there? What's happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like, I think they're sending, they're building up a considerable fleet. We're just talking about, not just a couple of boats off the coast, but just a significant portion of the U.S. Navy, which is already, which is a very large Navy. I think the last I checked, it was at least an eighth of the U.S. Navy. And then they were sending a couple more ships, including, they already have a submarine there, or submarines on its way there. And these are, major ships that are clearly not suited for smuggling interdiction. That's not what you use these missile carriers and submarines for. They fire missiles. And so maybe the U.S. is planning some kind of decapitation strike against Venezuela. Again, it's like the Israelis are leading the way. This is the new way to go after, your weaker opponents. There is one of the ships is an amphibious landing craft that has, I think, 2,000 Marines aboard. So they could put 2,000, but that's not enough to really invade the country. Maybe to carry out some sort of mission. I don't know exactly what it would be, but it looks like something is afoot. It really, why do you send that many ships? And I don't know. I find it embarrassing that that we would be so obsessed with this country, and we can't just leave them alone. You don't have to like Maduro or the government, but we don't need to do this. It's just. It seems like behavior that's not becoming to a real superpower. That one that has some sort of pretense to moral authority. Anyway, I think if we do it, it's going to actually just reduce our moral standing in the world that much more, especially within Latin America, because there is a great deal of sensitivity to past U.S. interventions. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Latin Americans haven't forgotten those. Going up into the second half of the 20th century, most definitely, they haven't forgotten those, and they're very sensitive about that. And this is even if the governments do not, in general, support Maduro's government in Venezuela, they're just not going to take kindly to this. There's going to be a very severe reaction, and I think you'll see Brazil moving even farther away from the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, are there a lot of drugs that go from Venezuela to the U.S. via boat?
I haven't heard that. It's not something I closely follow, but I haven't. When you hear about the big cartels, they're all
Mexico,
in Colombia. The U.S. actually has a lot of
Colombia, Mexico, right? I mean, those are the
Well, I mean, Mexico is partly they are in Mexico, but that's part of that is transit. Like when you're talking about, I think cocaine, like the growers are in Mexico, or the processors. That's where the drug is actually is prepared and packaged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, how the U.S. is trying to sell to the world, because it just seems like a very aggressive move. And I guess, is that how the whole world is looking at it? Just like, well, here's just another aggressive action. Is anybody understanding the justification and says like, okay, yeah, this makes sense? Or is the whole world like, this is what's happening?
It's hard to, right. It really seems, it's almost, I mean, it's actually kind of like it's what we called gunboat diplomacy, but maybe there's no even diplomacy involved in here. It is very crude and a kind of old style imperialism. And in a way, I think that could be better in that, we tear the mask from the imperialism. It's probably not something that probably not, you can't be sure, probably not something that would have been done under Biden. Though they were always putting the screws on Venezuela. I think they loosened them somewhat because for reasons of reducing oil prices. But in general, the hostility towards Venezuela is found on both sides of the aisle within the U.S. But the Democrats, or at least previous presidents, probably wouldn't have been this crude. They would be, maybe looking at special operations and CIA-sponsored coups and all kinds of nasty stuff and cruel economic sanctions. But this really, this sending the U.S. fleet and who knows what they're going to do. I don't think anybody but Trump would do that. But by doing that, he just makes it so plainly, painfully obvious to the rest of the world what the U.S. is about.
Do you think
it is the hegemon?
Right. I mean, I'm just trying to understand if it's not about the drugs, if that's just to cover, is it more about getting the oil? The
Yeah, well, I think obviously the oil is a big part of it. I mean, Venezuela is supposed to have the largest proven oil reserves in the world. I mean, it is a major, potentially, a very, very major oil producer. And it's already an important one, but it could be again. There are a lot of untapped reserves there. So yeah, obviously there is an interest in the oil itself, and then there's this general, I think, view again, kind of an extension of the Monroe Doctrine that this is our part of the world, and we just don't, we won't stand for having, a government that opposes us. Um, I think it's equally geopolitical and economic.
Do you think that Monroe Doctrine can even be enforced now? I mean, that's something that is part of that needs to be retired, right? You can't really have the Monroe Doctrine in the multipolar world.
Well, you can. I mean, the thing is, this is something that the U.S. almost certainly can get away with. Again, it is our part of the world, and these Venezuela is a poor, a weak country that doesn't have missiles of its own.
Well, get away with what? I mean, I still don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah, I don't know too either. But whatever it is, they might get away with it. I don't know. It's really bizarre. Who knows? But whether it's a decapitation strike. But even if they succeed in a decapitation strike or something like that, or they do land these 2,000 Marines there, they may be able to do a great deal of damage. But from I don't know a whole lot about Venezuela, but I think there is this kind of wishful thinking that we've often found within previous administrations, like with the invasion of Iraq. They're going to greet us with flowers and et cetera, et cetera. That just didn't happen. In the end, we were left with insurgency, and I think you find the same thing in Venezuela. There's a certain amount of dissatisfaction. There are people that are very passionately opposed to Maduro's government. But we saw that in Iran too. The moment that you actually invade, it's just like you've made friends of those enemies, and they have a new enemy, and it is you. That's what we may find. And even if they're weaker, it's their land. For them it's existential. They're mad. They have guns, and they're fighting in the jungle, and it just could be turned into a nightmare. I don't know what we're going to try to do, but it could go very badly wrong.
Right. So do you want to revise your statement that we can succeed in our own hemisphere?
Well, we might. I don't know what they're thinking of, or at least I don't know what it is that they're trying to carry out.
I feel like
it's just the thing is that we can't. Yeah, I think actually trying to occupy the country, or anything. Well, maybe 100 years ago we could do that. We can't do that now. I don't think so. I really don't. But maybe we could still wreak a great deal of destruction, just simply because we have all these missiles, or at least maybe we don't actually, but we'll find out. Destroy the presidential palace, maybe assassinate a lot of their leaders and throw the country into chaos. But we may be surprised, that the country and the movement that Maduro's government is built on may be much more resilient than we thought. But I'm not going to make any firm predictions. We can damage them. We can. But we can't really occupy the country, and I don't think we can impose a government. We could succeed in imposing a government to our liking. We might get Juan Guaido in there, but I doubt he would last very long. I think there would be everybody would see who he was. So, yeah, I guess what I'm just saying is that, yeah, I don't think we can work our will the way we could, again, a century ago under the old style imperialism. But we can just wreak a lot of damage without consequences, because again, they can't fight back, and they don't have any allies in the area that could really protect them. So if we just stay offshore firing missiles, I don't know what that would accomplish other than just a lot of destruction and maybe chaos, within Venezuela. And if that's all that we're aiming to do, then you could call it success, but I don't really see how that is to anybody's benefit, how that would be to anybody's benefit.
Yeah, everyone likes to talk about how powerful America is, and that it makes you think, okay, they'll have successes, I'll have successes. But I mean, just for me looking at it, we always say how powerful and omnipotent America is, but I just see a string of catastrophic failures again and again ever since World War II. I'm starting to wonder if World War II was much of a success, actually. But like, there's, I just feel like there's not the evidence to back it up for American success. Just we don't have it. Like, well, we have a successful military operation, regime change, any type of thing that we're talking about. Like we may overthrow government or just kill a lot of people, but it's never a success.
Right.
For the United States.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I think the exceptions to that statement. You're right. I think since World War II, there's no significant success that you can point to, that our wars have ended in failure, starting with the Korean War. In the end, well, you could say it was a partial success. The U.S. forces prevented the North Korean forces from taking over the entire peninsula. But then after that, it was a failure. We went farther north, were pushed back, and suffered significant casualties. In the end, had to agree to the truce that still isn't in effect. So it ended in failure. And then Vietnam, you have to say, was a failure. There's no success there. It's just a loss of a lot of life. We think about our own lives as natural. But, especially Vietnamese lives, something like 2 million Vietnamese died, because of that war. And then, you go on and on, the Iraq War, you say, well, we're still there. That you can't claim that was a success. That was a horrible failure. And Afghanistan, I mean, again, we're good at destroying, blowing up buildings and killing people. But to actually impose our will, a political solution, we have been miserable failures over the last several decades. I think there's no question about that. And so probably see the same in Venezuela. We might be able to overthrow this government just through, wreaking a lot of destruction on it, but it won't be that. But yet I would be very surprised if we're really able to impose our will on Venezuela and have a government that is just simply subservient to us. I think there will be so much anger that, any attempt to do that is bound to fail.
Mm-hmm. Well, the world will soon understand nothing can stop what's coming, according to Trump. So, I don't.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to?
Who knows what he's talking about?
I think this is. I don't think there's going to be another election. I think this is it for America. I don't think we're going to survive. I mean, look how close. It's only been 7-8 months. Like this type. It's got. Do you think we're going to make it? Can we get out of this?
I think we are, but yeah, it's been a wild ride. It's exhausting. It almost seems like it's been a whole 4 years already, and we're just
warming up.
Yeah, we're not even close to a quarter of the way through,
and we just all these conflicts. Trump was elected because everybody thought that he would draw down these conflicts, but right now, it's been 7-8 months, and now we got another conflict looming. Venezuela, we bombed Iran already. It looks like we're going to be ready. We're fully committed to whatever Israel wants to do. He's not pulling us out of Ukraine. That war continues. Now there's talk about long-range missile strikes, and he just oscillating between Putin and I are great friends. Oh, I hate that guy. We got to go on offense. Just like this is, and then cryptic messages about the end of the world, essentially, from him on Twitter, and saying that he wants to get to heaven and God's got a divine plan for him. I don't know. I mean, it's a coin toss.
Yeah, I would say that we're going to make it through the next 3.5 years.
Financial collapse on the horizon.
Yeah, right. Again, that's regardless of Trump. Though, Trump has exacerbated. Yeah, especially with he hasn't slowed down spending at all, and the tariffs, are creating a lot of economic chaos. Though recently there was that court decision against him, so those tariffs, or I think the great majority of them, may expire in October. We'll see. But anyway, it's been a wild ride, and there's a great deal of uncertainty. I have to say that on Ukraine, even though there is a lot of incoherence and a lot of reasons to worry, it still is better and has been better so far under him than it was under Biden. And the main thing I would point to was those missile strikes into pre-2014 Russian territory, that those have ended. And so far, it looks like, the Trump administration is sticking to that. And then there is some kind of effort to withdraw. This new arrangement to have the Europeans pay for it. That's something. It is. I think that's. Again, you never feel completely at ease or confident that any sort of arrangement that's been worked out will last, because we just see this as a very unpredictable character, and he just may. Who knows how. He may reverse himself. He can reverse himself on stupid decisions, which is great. He's done that on a few occasions, but he can reverse himself on on the right ones. One thing, like we say, I've said, and I know many other analysts have said, that, well, one thing that came out of that Alaskan summit meeting is that, okay, they agreed, okay, forget the ceasefire. We have to, Trump, accepted Putin, the Russian government's position, first a peace settlement, then a ceasefire. And so far, that's true, but I just don't have any confidence. And, maybe a month from now, he'll forget that he made that promise, and he'll start insisting on a ceasefire again.
Yeah.
So he's just, I just can't, I just don't have any sense of security when it comes to any of these decisions.
Right. I mean,
But
he's
you
just
have
all...
to say, so far when it comes to Ukraine, he has done better than Biden. I think we have to admit that. That's the one area where things seem a little... are less frightening than they were before, but that may change any day.
I don't know. It's just, he is just full of these reverse Uno cards. So it just, you just don't know. I don't feel safer. It's crazy to think that, I don't know if I would have felt safer with Biden. They're both horrible options, but it just, I'm not feeling any sense of relief since he's been in office. And just talking about just one last thing on Trump, and then we'll end it, is I think someone's knocking on the door here already. But I just saw, just scrolling through his Truth Socials, he tweeted, like, without tariffs, we would be a third world country. We've received $8 trillion. Tariff. I don't know if he's talking about, like, potentially if you do this for 100 years, but I just said we've got $8 trillion from tariffs to be a third world. These numbers, he just throws anything out there. There's no rhyme or reason to it.
No, I don't think he really has a head for numbers at all. They're just sort of rhetorical props for him. He just says these numbers, because it feels right, but I don't think there's any substance behind them. Yeah, there's definitely been an increase in revenue from tariffs, but we're talking, instead of trillions, we're talking about tens of billions. We maybe we're up to 100 billion. I don't know, but it's nothing like trillions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I got boys at the door, so
okay.
Let's call it a day. All right, Dad.
All right. Very good.
Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.